All right, so it's 2 p.m. Singapore time. So, while we will have more of our friends joining a little later, uh, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today for this very important and very interesting webinar on the sensitive data discovery and how MENTIS does it for you. Good afternoon to everyone in Singapore and good morning to everyone in India. Before we start, two very important things I want to ask. Number one, have you had your lunch? In Singapore, we do not start any discussion without asking for food. Have you had your lunch? Hope you had a good lunch. And second important thing is, what are you planning for dinner? so my Singapore friends will know that when we meet for breakfast, we ask for lunch. When we meet for lunch, we ask for dinner. That's how we do. And the second important thing I want to ask is, hope everybody has got both the vaccinations done and everybody is having masking up, right? So yeah, obviously because of the background, I'm unable to show mask. I've got both the vaccinations done and I always keep the mask ready with me. Before we start the webinar, some housekeeping rules. You know that it's about 1 hour, including the Q&A. We would love if everybody can ask as many questions as possible. Rajesh is here to answer. Second, as every other webinar, everybody is muted. You can ask questions in the chat. We have the moderators and the facilitators who will help those questions reach Rajesh, and Rajesh will be happy to answer them. The recording for this webinar will be made available almost after 24 hours, so you can check the links tomorrow to get the recording and go through it again if you want to. Quick introduction of Rajesh. Rajesh is the founder and CEO of MENTIS, and he is a chartered accountant by profession, by education. Now that's a very interesting combination, right? You do not expect a financial person to start a technology company, but he did that because when he was working with the Big Four, and when he was doing ERP consulting, he realized that ERP is nothing but all your company sensitive data and how easily it is available to everyone, right? So Rajesh thought that there has to be a reason and there has to be a method by which you could protect this data from going to the not expected hands, right? And that is how in 2004 he founded MENTIS. And I'm thinking we are talking about it in 2021. So Rajesh, can I call you a visionary who had this idea way back in 2004? And even in 2021, people are talking about the same issues, the same challenges, and in fact with bigger and more focus now. So Rajesh, I hand over to you if you could quickly share your journey and take us through the problems that the world is facing today in terms of the data discovery, data masking, and the other data security related issues, and how you've been helping your customers worldwide, including US, Europe, Asia, to mitigate these problems and ensure that their sensitive data is not going to the wrong hands. Over to you, Rajesh.
Thank you, Sunil. And by way of introduction, Sunil, of course, is my friend and colleague. He's helping MENTIS expand into the Asia Pacific region. And we'll discuss some more about MENTIS later on. So primarily, like Sunil was saying, my journey started off with CA, but I had a computer degree background before that, in addition to my college degree. And when I started implementing ERPs, I realized that there was actually no controls available. And from an audit standpoint, it was very difficult to rely on any accounting that came out of any ERP system. So I built the industry's first audit software for Oracle. It used to be called Oracle Financials. Now it's Oracle E-Business Suite. Through acquisitions, Oracle Corporation owns it as Oracle's GRC product line. I'd also built some information lifecycle management solutions for Oracle ERP and PeopleSoft and other data stores, which is now owned by Informatica as Informatica's lifecycle management program. So when I started MENTIS, like Sunil was saying, it was way ahead. I was talking about internal threat. I was talking about insider threat. I was talking about developers and DBAs have accessing to too much information, which was way back in 2004. when most security folks did not understand the risk we were talking about. So we were in consulting for quite a bit while building the product on the side. And starting 2014 onwards, we've been selling it as a product. We'll discuss more about MENTIS and what the product suite does later on. But from an agenda standpoint, we'll talk about why are we even here, right? Like, why is this data discovery topic of any importance and why is it timely? We'll talk about some things that governments are doing globally for protecting the reason why we are here. And then we'll talk about why is sensitive data discovery important and why it is not as simple as some people would help lead you to believe, right? So that, and then we'll close off with Q&A. I'll tell you a little bit about MENTIS and the product suite itself. So the first reason why we're here is if you're watching news, you're seeing there are multiple breach notifications that are happening globally, right? In the past, 10 years ago, these breaches did happen, but nobody bothered to tell you about it because there was no mandates. Now, because of growing regulations around the world, organizations are forced to disclose when they have a data breach, and they have to disclose it within a reasonable time frame. Now, what happens after the breach is disclosed varies wildly from country to country, right? In really evolved countries like Singapore or some parts of Europe and some parts of the United States, there are regulations like Singapore's PDPA and Europe's GDPR and US's California's CCPA. So they are mandated to announce this, but in countries like India, where we don't have the actual IDPL or the India Data Protection Law or India's Personal Data Protection Act, there is no reason to publish it unless it is requested by someone or there is a scoop that's happening. Like Air India had a data breach, I think Domino's had a data breach, and they're not mandated to let us know about that, and there are no ramifications of such a breach. So what countries have been doing, because they've been noticing that these breaches happening and citizens' data keeps getting exposed, many geographies, as of early January, I think the first week of January, 120 countries had some breach law, some privacy law, some data protection law in some form that they had passed or they were in the process of passing. Singapore was ahead of the curve, and I think they passed it quite a long time back. GDPR was passed in 2014 and went into effect in 2018. CCPA went into effect in 2020, which is California's only regulation. And then there's PAPI in South Africa, there's PIPEDA in Canada. So you're seeing that this map get filled. The gray parts are going to disappear and they're going to be replaced with more and more blue. And if anybody has any questions about these types of laws, feel free to let us know. I'll be glad to explain them. But the point here is breaches have been happening for a while, but now governments are doing something about it, right? Like to expect corporates to spend on something that does not actually add revenue or reduce cost is a tough ask because they're all in the business of succeeding financially. So these regulations are generally considered costs, so they don't do it. But these new regulations are mandating these companies to do things. But it is not just the government asking for it, right? So this is a research report that IBM and the Ponemon Institute in the US, they publish every year. So this is the latest that was published just last week. And you'll notice that the average cost of a breach is now starting to tend to be very high, right? Like US in 2021, it's $9 million on average if you have a breach. And what constitutes this cost is very different. For example, in the US, there have been reports that said that if you have a data breach, you'll have 23% customer attrition. You also have to provide credit monitoring for 3 years. So that those types of costs add up and they go up to 9.05. And it varies countries to countries, but basically the trend is every year, the average cost of a data breach is increasing. And every year, the number of breaches are increasing. Every year, the sophistication of the breaches are increasing, and every year, the volume of records that are being breached is increasing. So this is a trend that has been like this for the last several years from the time this information has been kept track. And the global average is 4.24 million. It might seem small, But imagine this is an average breach size, right? Like, so you're talking about some really large breaches and some really small breaches all combined. And just last night, there was a new, an extension of this report was published in the Indian newspapers. The Hindu and the Economic Times carried it. And the average breach for an Indian company would be in the 165 million rupee range. And that is a big amount of money for almost any business to have to deal with. So privacy regulations means governments are mandating that they're providing rights to citizens for protection of the data. Now there's also actual business reasons why you need to protect it, right? So no, it is not a hypothetical cost anymore. These numbers are real. These numbers are being evident. And it has become a place where a data breach is more of a when than an if. So just like Sunil was talking about masking yourself, I think masking your data also becomes important. But any form of data protection does not start with discovery, right? A little bit of further insight into what those costs tend to be. So these are all US numbers, but they basically happen to be similar globally, right? Healthcare, financial, and pharmaceutical and technology industries are a lot more expensive when there's a data breach. And they're also larger targets, they're easier targets. Now, in fact, healthcare has zoomed up because of COVID and COVID-related information that's being captured by organizations, and the pharmaceutical companies also creating these vaccinations. They also have a treasure trove of information. So in the pandemic stage, there is no honor among thieves, right? Like when people are suffering, that's when they feel it's easier to steal. And if you look at this screen on the right, these are the types of misuses that are happening, right? Like privilege abuse. So somebody is looking at data that they're not supposed to, data mishandling, using information that they're not supposed to, all of this around the use of data. But again, this is all why we're talking about sensitive data discovery. A little bit more insight into what sort of information is being accessed. So PII is personally identifiable information, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But basically, if you look at the types of records compromised, it's all around PII. Intellectual property is important, but mostly it is employee and customer PII. And then if you look at the average cost, any information of your customers that you retain, that costs you more. Should you have a data breach, employees are next. So these are the most expensive, valuable information that you store from having to protect it. And again, more detail in this. We'll share this presentation and we'll share this recording as well if you want to listen to it. But this information is available in the Verizon 2021 data breach report and the IBM cost of data breaches report as well. So that is all fine. What we're talking about is all of this type of information is being accessed. This is the type of information that is most valuable for data theft. This is the type of information that if you have dark web accounts, you can go find, you can pay for and buy these records. But what is it? What data are these regulations trying to protect? We know that some data is more valuable than others. We know that thieves are heading after and hackers are heading after, or miscreants are heading after certain specific types of information. But what is it? So the way to look at it, to document what that data is, MENTIS looks at all of the global regulations, right? Like each privacy regulation that happens around the world, we look at them and they all talk about what is called data elements. We call them data classifications because it's just a simple way to classify information in the different types of information that's stored, but it is simple business terms that they're looking for. Names, addresses, email addresses, national identifiers, phone numbers. So in this world, there are two different types of information. One is a direct identifier, and then the other one is an indirect or quasi-identifier. A direct identifier is anything that can identify a person directly. So for example, if it's your national identifier, that will identify you directly to a high degree of uniqueness. Your first name alone is an indirect identifier. Your first name alone is not unique enough. Just if you just say Rajesh, or if you just say Sunil, or if you say Sugumar, none of that will directly identify a person unless if you provide some extra pieces of information. So those are called quasi-identifiers. So anything that will directly identify a person on its own is a direct identifier. Anything that will identify a person through a combination of other such elements is called a quasi-identifier or an indirect identifier. Why am I saying all this, right? So if you look at our regulations, so these are the different types of regulations that these regulations are talking about. GDPR, CCPA, Singapore's PDPA, HIPAA, LGPD in Brazil, and IDPL in India. These are the data elements that they're talking about protecting. What you will see is after a period of time, after the first low-hanging fruit regulations and legislation, data classifications, you'll notice that some regulations go a slightly different way. Why is eye color and hair color, why is this data sensitive? Again, these quasi-identifiers, right? So let's say you are in India, and if I told you the person was blonde, right? You probably have two people in India that have blonde hair. So it becomes that uniqueness makes it easy to identify. If you follow the NBA, if I say, I'm looking at data of people that are directors in Chinese corporations and their height is 7 feet 6 inches. You probably are talking about Yao Ming, right? It makes it easier. So these are the quasi-identifiers. A few years back, somebody from Harvard University in the US, they did a research report and they said with the 1978 census in the US, just by using gender, zip code, and date of birth, they could reverse engineer more than 2/3 of the US Census data. Just think about that, right? Gender, zip code, and date of birth. They're not telling you the name, they're not giving you anything else. But with those three seemingly random pieces of information, if you put them together, you can reverse and figure out whom you're talking about to a 67 degree of certainty. That is pretty high. Those numbers have just subsequently changed as the US population grows. Those numbers have subsequently changed, but the principle is right. So if the concept of protecting data, in the context of preserving privacy, you have to preserve privacy in any which way. You have to make sure that you cannot find out who the employee is by looking at their weight or their shoe size or any color, right? Or any combination of this type of information. So if you take MENTIS as an organization, we have about 80 employees. So if you say of the 80 employees, if you say first people that live in India, that alone is not anything that is sensitive. And then you say people that have black hair, again, not very unique. But then you say he wears a size XXL shirt, that's probably me, right? So those are the types of piece of information that are not obvious, but it is important from ensuring security and compliance and privacy. So it is important for us to document all of these types of regulations. Some of them are mandated by regulation, but some are also just common sense. So we build all of these data classifications. It's important if you're starting a data classification and data discovery exercise, think beyond the absolutely obvious, because when you're protecting privacy, you need to think outside of these regulations, right? It's important. It's all about uniqueness. It's all about finding out which that person is and protecting that data. So that's why data discovery is important. And we're going to talk about how we go about doing this, right? So these are the different data classifications that will be important when you embark on a regulation or a discovery exercise. Now, why is this even more challenging, right? Like data discovery is not hard. Every single time when MENTIS has engaged with an organization, the customer tends to feel that they know where their data is. And they're right. They're right. Majority of that data, they know where that data is. But what is happening is there are newer regulations coming in. There's newer data stores that are coming in. There are patches being applied. There are lots of developers that are writing stuff. There are employees that are pulling information out of their production systems and they're storing it down in either a non-production system or in files or Excel spreadsheets. Data is sent out, data is received. So sensitive data is everywhere for any organization, and it's exacerbated by the problem of us creating more and more data than we ever did. So this is the amount of zettabytes of data that we are creating year over year, right? Like 2020, we created 64.2 zettabytes worth of data. And then it went to 79 in 2021. It's going to go to 97. And then eventually, in another 5 years, we're going to triple what we created in 2020. But just for us to get our head wrapped around what we're talking about, there are like 21 zeros there. Each zettabyte has 21 zeros. So that's a lot of information. So Rajesh probably is stored in a computer system in like 4 bytes, right? So if that's the volume of bytes of information that we're creating, it is a massive problem. So just underestimating the degree of complexity in finding the data, which I'll also talk about, and underestimating the volumes that we have to deal with is another thing that we need to constantly keep on top of, and not underestimate the reason to do sensitive data discovery in a very polished and sophisticated way. Now, there have data discovery is not new. Data discovery has been around for a while for a variety of purposes. It could have been for the creation of a master data management program. It could have been for data quality. It could have been for different purposes. And for all of those purposes, some way or shape or form, there have been solutions. But when you're looking at privacy, remember I was talking about the collection of quasi-identifiers together to reverse the identity of a person. With all of that, and with these new regulations and the cost of these data breaches, you cannot afford to take half-hearted ways of finding the data. So typically, people in large data systems, people look at data dictionary, which we find only finds a small percentage of the actual data. Some companies have used RegEx, which was fine in 2010, but it's not fine anymore because there's so much false positives created. And when you were dealing with false positives, you have apathy, right? Like if somebody gives you a report and says, oh, I scanned your database and now here's a report of about 20,000 columns, which could be sensitive data, you're not going to pay attention to it because you're busy. Everybody is busy with something else. They're not going to waste their time. Or even if they do that and then they figure it out and then they lower it down to like about 20 columns that have sensitive data, now your second application comes in and you whole boatload of false positives. So putting in all of these false positives ends up creating apathy in the people that are reviewing these reports. When we designed applications through the rapid growth of ERPs and all of these applications in the late 90s into the aughts, we didn't create proper data models, and we didn't necessarily create proper MDMs, master data management applications. We didn't store data where it's supposed to. And a lot of the connections between data was written in application logic rather directly in the data model. So there's one column that has, let's say, name, and then another column that has name. 90% of that is, or 45% of that, is only written in application logic. It's not written as foreign key, primary key. It's not made, any relationship is not defined in the database. So finding that becomes very complex. And as you have attrition, as you have growth, as you bring in new applications, you don't have the empirical knowledge of what that application logic is, what the connections are. And this problem becomes bigger the more applications you have. On an average, any reasonable bank will have at least 200 applications and at least 200 or 300 petabytes worth of data, zettabytes now, petabytes worth of data. What happens is relying on somebody knowing all these application connections also is fraught with risk because you just don't have enough people to know all this stuff. And then we've also had some bad habits, which I guess came from the COBOL world, where you piped data or you stored the same different rows in the same column, stored different types of information. Those are called composite columns, either key value pairs or piping data together to make a larger data set. If your organization has any application like that uses IMS as a data store, which is a legacy from the 70s mainframe system, their entire data is stored in data value, pipe data value, pipe data value, pipe data value, and there is no information as to what that middle value is. It could be credit card number, it could be somebody's salary, hopefully they're making a lot of money, but there is no information there. So relying on any form of manual exercise or using RegEx, you're going to have a really wasted exercise, or you're going to have false positives. This exercise will never end. It is not something that any reasonable size organization can ever get a handle on and ever grow. So what we have done is create a solution that we've been using this for a few years now. We've got some brand name customers we'll discuss later, that is ranked highest. It's 4.8 out of 5 on Gartner Peer Insights, and it addresses those exact problems to be able to do data discovery at scale, but also do it rapidly and without false positives, right? So it has those 3 primary benefits to how MENTIS operates. So the overall exercise is data classifications tell me what data is sensitive to you, and the data discovery exercise, which is our patented exercise, actually discovers the data. And sometimes our application also goes through and crawls the code to see how data is connected. And then once we have that map, we can also find which users have access to sensitive data. So these are all puzzle pieces, but primarily this is the primary puzzle piece for any data protection that happens downstream, whether it is data masking, whether it is monitoring, whether it is encryption, whatever you want to do to protect that data. If you don't have a complete and accurate assessment and without false positives assessment of where your data is, those exercises become complicated and are prone to failure. So let's talk about our discovery. And I'm going to give you some examples of what we've been seeing, what we've been doing here. And this has evolved over a period of years, right? Nobody can come up with a solution on day one. So it has to go through multiple iterations of running this application against really complex application sets, all the way from mainframes to big data to Google BigQuery to Snowflake, files all over the place. What we did was find a unique patented approach where we do a lot of the work in a very smart way. We do a lot of heavy scanning, but in the smartest possible way. So we take a four-step approach. First one is a focused effort, right? And I'll explain that in a minute. And most of the time we run this inside the data store, which is not important, but I'll talk about that later as well. First, we focus the effort. So this is an example of an application. So this is an Oracle database at a customer, which is about 2.4 terabytes worth of data. And the customer is looking for 29 data classifications, things like IBAN number, which is European international banking account number, names, addresses, that type of information. And what we did, there were about 72,000 columns in that application. There was no manual, there was no data model document, nothing like that. So we just basically had to start from scratch. So the first thing our application does automatically, it eliminates unnecessary fluff. It eliminates columns that have no chance of storing sensitive information, right? If I'm looking for IBAN, which is a 16-digit number, there is no chance that can be, and it is a varchar, it has characters, it has numbers. There's no chance it could be in a date column. There's no chance it could be in a number column. There's no chance it could be in a varchar to a 4 column. So we eliminate all of that, and then we focus on only the columns that could potentially have sensitive data. We also eliminate empty rows, empty columns, all of that. So that automatically reduced it to only 10,000 columns. So I already made my discovery exercise a little bit easier because I'm not going after 72,000 columns, I'm going after 12, right? So I made my work 1/6 automatically, right? So I'm thinking about doing this in a smart way. Then what our application does is it does a data distribution analysis. If you think about any enterprise application, there are 3 types of data. One is configuration information, which is basically telling the system what to do and how to do, when to do what, right? Like it's just basically setting things like a 3-way match flag or what to do if a purchase order is returned. Though that is configuration data, very small number of rows and a very small number of tables, and they generally don't have sensitive information. They're important from an audit perspective, but not from this data discovery exercise. The next set of tables is operational tables. Operational data is anything that your business relies on to do business with, like employees, customers, vendors, partners, products. Those all are operational data, and there's a lot of data, and it is all sensitive, but it is not as big as the next step, which is your transactional data, right? So configuration, operational, and transactional. The transactional data pyramid is the bottom of the pyramid. There's lots of data, but the good news is it is repetitive. So for example, if you have your invoice distributions table, that invoice distributions table, last month's invoice distribution will be very similar to this month's invoice distribution. It will be very similar to last year's invoice distribution. So what we do is we analyze it, and then we figure out where that data is, how that data is, and we find that red line there is a sample number. So we pick that number and we say 100,000 unique values from each column. What that will do is it'll give us 98.6% of data coverage, right? Basically, every operational table, every column that has sensitive data will get scanned 100%. Every transactional data column will get scanned 100% as long as the data is repetitive. Only outlier columns, like let's say you have an 8 billion row table and a transactional table, and you have unvalidated text field, right? Like those columns are not worth the trouble of scanning completely. We just want to check 100,000 values and see if anybody's putting any sensitive data in there. And even if they put one value of sensitive information in there, we will mark that column as this is sensitive, we got to address it. So this way, MENTIS covers 98.6% of the data in an extraordinarily smart way, right? So that only tells us that we are scanning a lot of data. We could still give a lot of false positives if we relied completely on artificial intelligence, if we relied on completely on the data dictionary, we could rely completely on RegEx. So what MENTIS does, it doesn't stop there. So then, once I know what my sample size is, we put every column through an exercise of evaluation, right? We do 4 or 5 different analyses for each column, for each data classification. That way, we leave no true negatives, and we also lower the amount of false positives because we find multiple reasons. So natural language processing, which is part of artificial intelligence and named entity recognition, this is used in a very clever way. Generally, what happens is for most data discovery exercises that are purely AI or NL, you have the same problem as you have with RegEx, because the amount of training you have to do is very, very, very high. It'll take you like 3 or 4 months before it can even be productive. RegEx will give you so many false positives, just reading through all that nonsense takes a lot of time. So MENTIS does all of that combined in a simple, easy, integrated way that we run this as quickly as possible, as thorough as possible, but also eliminate the amount of manual work you have to do to keep your data going. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. So let's say we're looking for national identifier. Singapore has a national identifier, India has a national identifier, US has a national identifier. So what our application does is, yeah, we pay attention to, if you're going after a data, enterprise data store like a big data platform or Snowflake or Google BigQuery or Oracle or SQL Server, we check the data dictionary first to see if there are some columns that are obvious, right? Because I want to be smart. I don't want to do extra work. If a column is called social security number, why would I do any more work, right? We're trying to do this smart. So we find columns like that, and then we look for any relationships that exist. If it doesn't exist, then we look at other columns and we see if they have 9-digit numbers, and then we validate them against known patterns. We validate it back against what columns we know are master data, and then wherever possible, wherever necessary, then we start using natural language processing for unstructured data. Because structured data is easy. There's a lot of cheating possibilities there in finding information. We can look at code, we can look at triggers, we can look at master data, we can look at data volume. There's a lot of stuff that we can do in structured data. In unstructured data, we use natural language processing, and then we enhance that by saying, okay, there's a Word document that contains what looks like a social security number, and it has a necessary NER tag, but does that data match anywhere else that I know has sensitive data? So it does all this corroborative checks around to provide reports that tell you where is the data, what is MENTIS's confidence on that data being national identifier. And so that's what national identifier, right? So it's a very structured data. It has a specific pattern. You can validate it. But what if the data that I'm looking for itself has no pattern? Then we rely on other methods. Then we rely on looking for master data. We find any column that we know has names, and then look for those same names in other places. Use named entity recognition again with the natural language processing to find sensitive data across structured and unstructured data. So it's important for us to not think of this as an easy exercise. It is a complex exercise, but it is something that can be handled with a degree of sophistication. So that's how our application has been developed to do different things for different data classifications to match the different data stores.
Rajesh, can I ask a question here?
Sure.
Unstructured data, I understand, right? Because that's why it's called unstructured data, right? But I would have expected the DBAs to know, at least in the structured data, where the sensitive information lies. And based on whatever I hear from you, it looks like that even the structured data is really painful for people to know where the sensitive information is, which column, which row, etc. Based on what you shared, I mean, this is something interesting for me to know. Yeah,
that's a good question, Sunil. And you would expect that organizations would know, but the minute your organization becomes a little bit more complex, the minute you have multiple people touching these structured databases, the minute there are patches, the minute you have users adding data and value wherever they need to, the empirical knowledge of where your sensitive data is expected to be does not match the reality of where the sensitive data is. There is one particular healthcare company in California where they built their own product, and they were using field operators to enter information at the bedside, right? So the developers that wrote the application and the DBA that managed the application through the creation of it, they had their own data model. They knew where the sensitive data was, and they were using some product to do data masking based on that knowledge. That data masking would always fail, and then post masking, a lot of the application wouldn't work, and they never understood why that was. And then we started a discovery exercise, right? And remember, these are the people that built the application. They know exactly where sensitive data is supposed to be stored. They're the developers that wrote it. They know every part of it. But what was happening is people on the field, they were using different columns to store information. Because if somebody is a nurse practitioner and she's standing by the bedside and she's taking notes furiously, she's not going to go back 3 fields and put in social security number where it is intended to be. She'll put it wherever she possibly can, because she needs to. Her job is helping the patient. Her job is not being a data entry operator, right? So when we scanned, within 3 hours, we found that they only knew where 25% of the sensitive data was, right? Every customer, every time we've gone through this, we always find more data than the customer was aware of. There has never been a single customer where they had complete handle, because it just, things change, things go on. The minute you have multiple developers, and most organizations have both bespoke applications that they built themselves. They also buy lots of COTS products from outside. One COTS product might have been built by developers in India, one would have been built in the US, one in Israel. They all have different conventions, different way of storing data. And a lot of these applications were built before this type of privacy awareness, right? So they would store information all over the place. They would not document where they're storing. They would create like runtime files where the data is documented and then it's used later on, and then they forget about it. So this understanding of where your sensitive data is, it is the first thing that everybody should understand is we probably don't know where it is. Start with that assumption. You would already know about 80-85% of the data, but then other 15% is pesky. Finding that is very difficult, but is extraordinarily important, both from a compliance standpoint, security standpoint, and from an application usability standpoint.
Rajesh, I was talking to the head of data of a bank, and they're like, considering that it's a bank, they will have like tens of petabytes of data, right? And he said, Sunil, I'm just going crazy. You know, the amount of false positives that come up. He says, imagine going to sleep with a thought that I have these petabytes of data where I don't know what's happening. You know, the false positives are really creating more problem than what they're solving, right? And they were doing all the data masking, everything is in place. He said, Sunil, we had to just rip it out. We had to throw this solution out because we could not deal with those the problems that these solutions were creating. So my question to you is, while you spoke about false positive, I understand Mentis is doing it in a different manner. I've been in security 25, 26 years, right? I wouldn't like to believe that there's any solution which doesn't create false positive, right? So I'm sure Mentis would have some false positives coming in. So would you be able to share with us the extent of false positives, you know, that get created and using Mentis solutions, and how much time your typical customers take to weed out those false positives, if that's okay for you to share?
Yeah, right. So my first ever data discovery exercise was doing this thing called pattern matching. So my first customer, where we ran this on a beta test, I did a challenge with them. They were a very friendly customer. I've known them for years. So they said that it was a large university. They said that they knew in one of their core systems that social security number was stored in 17 places. So when I scanned it and I used pattern matching, basically I was looking for 9-digit numbers everywhere, right? Which is what RegEx does. But at those days, there was no RegEx. We built our own pattern recognition engine, which in a lot of ways is helping us now. So we looked for any column that had 9-digit numbers, and I came back with them with a list of 1,105 columns. Everybody was shocked, but again, this was 2008, right? Like this was way before anybody else was thinking like this. So they were shocked. And then what we did was, my team and I, we sat and we found reasons to eliminate information from that 1,105. First, we checked, does this pass known social security number validations, right? If it's all zeros, if it's all nines, it's not a US social security number. So then we built some validation functions. So a pattern finds it, and then a function validates it to see if it passes known validation. Then I brought it down to like 600 columns. Then I checked, it does the same data exist in my employees table or in my customers table or my students table, and that validates with master data. And then now I brought the information, and then we did a lot of other matches. We did a few ways. Was there any code connected within PL SQL, or there's like a view or a function that connects all this? Then we started doing code analysis, and eventually we came up with a list of about 45 columns where I told the customer, I'm 100% certain that these columns are social security numbers. If you don't believe me, here is a statement that you can go run yourself and validate this for yourself. And I gave him all the reasons why I believed it. I said, this has a 9-digit number pattern. It passes all known social security number values, and it matches your master data to greater than a 70% accuracy. I gave them all these reasons. And then when they looked at it, those 45 were really sensitive data. I think 2 of them were still incorrect because the US social security number has very little validations. But I found 26 more columns than they were aware of with 2 false positives, right? All of that analysis that we did to eliminate false positives, we baked into the product. It became the product. So all of these steps has come through experience, has come through providing too much information. And our objective is, I want to give my customer information on where their sensitive data is, but I also want them to be able to act on it. I don't want them spending hours and days trying to eliminate false positives. There was one customer where we were in a competitive situation. It's one of the world's largest healthcare companies. And we had a proof of concept side by side with another vendor. That vendor finished their exercise on a PeopleSoft system, 2.7 million columns. They finished their exercise in a couple of hours and they provided a report and they went away. MENTIS ran for 24 hours. So the customer came back and said, why in the world are they 12 times faster than yours? So why would I buy MENTIS when your application is so slow? And I didn't know the answer. I just said, but did you compare the reports? Did you look at our report and did you look at their report? So they said, okay, give me a couple of days. So they went back 3 days, they did some analysis and came back and they bought our software, of course. That's why I'm telling the story. But what they realized was MENTIS found more information and provided the reasons and had none of the false positives, right? Because we'd already built in all of those ways of eliminating those false positives. And like you say, Sunil, I'm not saying 100% we won't have false positives, but when we create false positives, our application gives the customer a reason as to why we think it could be sensitive data, and we ask them for training, and we give them, here is the, so if it's unstructured data, right, we'll say, on this folder, on this file, in page 3, we found Robert, or we found a social security number, here are the reasons. We do that for structured data also, and we provide the reasons, and with structured data, we give them a query, say, go run this query, you'll see exactly the data that we're talking about. And we do this so that we don't have to replicate the data outside of the system. But this is how we make sure our customers we eliminate as many false positives as possible. So, and that actually goes here. Like, let me just show you this. So this is what we are seeing generally, right? Like an enterprise application we know nothing about. Typically, MENTIS runs in 5 days. And the amount of human time the customer has to operate on is very less compared to how much time the machine time does. So if you compare our approach to just a regex-based approach, or just an artificial intelligence approach, their approach will run faster, but the customer will have like 4 weeks worth of manual work to do. Whereas our approach, the amount of human intervention is probably 8 hours in a week's exercise. So it's built for that, built to eliminate false positives, provides the reasons, helps the customer laser focus on where we need their training help. And with each application we onboard, our application gets faster because once you train it, once our application understands the naming convention of the customer, we start using it, and then our application gets trained and it starts working faster. So we're back, we're about 15 minutes left. So let me go to my introducing MENTIS to all of you. So MENTIS is a software product company. We're US based, and predominantly our customer base was North America and Western Europe. But very recently, we've won a deal with one of Singapore's most prestigious universities, and also with the largest bank in Indonesia. We call our solution GPS for enterprise data. The G stands for governance, the P for privacy, and the S for security. And It's a single product suite that does a lot of things. It starts with the discovery of data, and then once the data is discovered, it can do some static data masking for non-production databases, dynamic data masking for production databases and applications, activity monitoring, database firewall, and all the way to data minimization. So that data minimization is a very, very important piece of information that everyone that's interested in privacy should be aware of. This is what all of the privacy regulations are now heading towards, providing citizens of those geographies the right to ask an organization to delete information that you store about them, right? And this solution has been live with our customers for a while. So what Sunil and I will do is we'll set up some follow-up sessions around what is masking, what is data minimization, and those of you that are interested, you can submit other topics, and we will make sure we go through these exercises to show you how customers globally are addressing these. We work on a lot of structured data, a lot of unstructured data, and big data platforms, whether they're on your premise or on the cloud. And some of the awards that we've been winning recently, we are a customer's choice for data masking 2 years in a row, data discovery and data masking. We are a Forrester Wave strong performer, the highest rated current offering in dynamic data masking by Forrester. Gartner actually named us an organization that puts its customers first. And you'll see other analysts also saying really good things about us. And it's a single source of intelligence. The discovery rules are all present in a hub and spoke concept, right? There is a single engine that then scans all of your data source and then says, here is where your enterprise sensitive data is. So that's what our application works on. And some of our customers, you'll notice that it was predominantly West, and then with Sunil's introduction, we're also moving further East. We have, like I said, we just closed a large deal at the largest bank in Indonesia, leading university in Singapore, and we're seeing more and more activity in Asia Pacific, and we're expecting further growth in these areas. Again, our customers think very highly of us. We are the highest ranked discovery and data masking solution vendor in the market, and every capability within that, we have the highest score. We share the lead with another vendor for a couple of them, but overall we are the highest rated. All of our ratings are 4-star or higher, and 100% of our customers are willing to recommend. And there's a lot of information about MENTIS. You can look at Bloor, you can look at Forrester. There's about discovery, there's information both on Forrester and Bloor that you can look at that talks about MENTIS and what all you should be aware of. And this is the latest Forrester report that I talked to you about, where MENTIS has the highest current offering rating. The only reason we were not a leader is because our application does everything on its own. It doesn't need additional partners to perform operations, because we discover, we mask, we encrypt, we protect, we do all those things. So our partner strategy is not as evolved as they would like it to be, but current offering ours is the strongest offering. So I've come to the end of my slides. We can answer some Q&A now.
Rajesh, what interested me to join hands with you was because I've been in data security for a long time now. And whenever I talk to my customers, they say, Sunil, okay, do you expect me to buy data classification somewhere, security from somewhere, masking from somewhere, and anonymization, minimization from somewhere, and a different solution for this database, different solution for my unstructured data, and then figure out how do I manage it all, right? So and thinking like a chief data officer or a CI or a CDO, whoever, or CISO, whoever is responsible, I would like to have a single solution which is like helping me across, so that I do step by step. I do understand that discovery itself is a big step before I jump onto the next step. So there is a time required. The software has to become familiar with my entire data ecosystem and learn it, and then give me a proper discovery with the minimum number of false positives before I take the next step of masking it or minimizing it or right to erasure, right to forget. I mean, before I start applying all those. So this was something that I thought was very interesting, and I understand that in 1 hour session it's very difficult to cover it all. So if everybody here likes what MENTIS does, we would of course love to follow up with a more data masking kind of a session, and with a live demo as well or everybody, every friend who's joined here, you could get in touch with me, Rajesh, or our other team members one-on-one for more information or for demos. Uh, uh, I would love to
More
open.
questions, Sunil. Should we start answering them?
Definitely, yeah. I would love to open for questions. Yeah.
So there are privacy laws in Russia and Ukraine. Thank you. Yes, I am aware. We will include that. So that image came from. That was not a MENTIS image. That is an image from someone else that we used, and it's also getting. There are more updates to those regulations also being considered now. So we will update it. Thank you for that information. And then someone asked, does data classification of MENTIS works same like how Titus or Bolton James classification works? Meaning, where does the classification tag is available? So yes and no. MENTIS starts with the large data stores first, right? It starts with your biggest data platforms, your mainframes, your enterprise data lakes, your data warehouses, and then from there goes to the file servers. And the classification tags are not as important in structured databases because we maintain this in our application. We maintain information on which database, which table, which column contains what sort of information. And that is also available through APIs into any reporting solution. When it comes to file servers, we also add all of the data tags to documents that are able to receive those tags so that any DLP solution can use it. All of our information is stored in a single repository, and then they get pushed out to either the files themselves or to other reporting mechanisms or other tools. So it's friendly to so that it can be used everywhere. Where we actually go farther than anybody else is, and you can look, there is a report by Bloor that actually these are words that they use. MENTIS goes farther than any other data classification vendor in its classification of data, because our objective is to not finish the work fast, but our objective is to eliminate your manual work. So that's something that we are very good at, and we can discuss that more in person as well. And somebody had asked about the application code, database code analysis method. So I was telling you a lot of the logic of how sensitive data is stored is in application code or in database code and logic, right? So let's say I find a column called value, and that value column, some of the rows has something that looks like a national identifier. So specifically, US Social Security number is a 9-digit number, right? It has very little intelligence built into it. So if I'm looking for Indonesian national identifier, I know some of the digits have meaning. So I can write some code, some analysis methods to eliminate false positives. So if it says XX, it's probably not Indonesian code, but if it is CH, it means something. So there is some intelligence in the data. But if it's something like a US Social Security number, there's no intelligence in the data. So then I cannot just rely on pattern match. I just cannot rely on a value match, the validations, because it's not that heavy. So then what I have to do is I will look for any PL SQL procedure, any views, any functions where a known column, let's say there's a column called Social Security number, which I know is a master data column, and then I find a view somewhere deep inside that says known column of national identifier equal to value column, then I know the value column is surely a Social Security number. So that's what we use the code analysis for, and it's actually given us such long, great insight into how the application is using data. I hope I answered your question. If you have a follow-up, please let me know. While performing sensitive data discovery in a typical customer scenario, does MENTIS have a competitive performance figures? X company solution does it in certain time, and MENTIS does it in how much period? Thank you for that question. We actually don't worry about how long our process takes. We worry about how accurate our solution is. And if out of context, you're just comparing the speed of MENTIS versus the speed of another vendor, they would be faster. But then if you see what is your time to value, when are you done with that data discovery exercise, MENTIS is always faster, right? Like overall. So that slide that I had, a typical discovery exercise would take 30 days for an enterprise application. Whereas their product will probably run in a couple of hours, and then you've got like 28 and a half days worth of work to finish that work. MENTIS will probably run for 3 days, but then your whole exercise will be finished in 5 days. So we've got some information like that, but it's not very one-to-one speed of machine time versus speed of machine time. It's overall time to value. I hope that answered your questions. So are there any other questions? Would be, thank you. Do you have a masking option to protect the data or encryption as well? If encryption, please elaborate. Yeah, we have, so Mentis has a patent on being the only solution that does discovery, masking, tokenization, and encryption. So depending on what the need is and depending on where that data is stored and how it is stored, we can provide any of those options. So when we do encryption, we use AES 256 because that's what's common across all the data platforms that we protect. When all the data platforms move to a higher thing like SHA-3, then we can automatically go to SHA-3. We have a very unique way of doing that encryption where we generate encrypted values in a single data store, and then we propagate that, and then we use our dynamic data masking to reverse the encryption. So we've been doing this now for a couple of years, and typically our encryption decryption is 7 times faster because we don't need any code changes, we don't need any application APIs to be interjected. It's a simpler, more straightforward exercise. We just make sure it is a measured approach, and it is not like file system, it is actual column level encryption. So we ask our customer, if a customer is looking at 29 data classifications, our recommendation is don't encrypt all 29. Encrypt like 2 or 3 of those data classifications that are highly critical, and the rest deploy dynamic data masking. And Mentis can do all of them seamlessly, interchangeably. How are you managing your encryption keys and where are the keys getting stored? So our central engine is where the keys are generated, and then the keys are thrown away. So it's a vaultless exercise that we have built on top of existing encryption logic. So let's say there's an Oracle database. We use Oracle's native AES 256. We ask the customer to enter a bunch of information using which we make the DEK and the KEK, which is the data encryption key, and the key encryption key, and then we generate values, and then we throw all of that away, and then with the generated values, we perform the rest of the operation. It's a very clever way of not storing. Again, is it FIPS 142 certified? Is Oracle's AES 256 FIPS 142 certified? If it is, then our solution is, because we've just built our logic on top of the native encryption mechanisms, so we don't need our own certifications.
Rajesh, there's one more question. How do you plan to discover data that is stored encrypted due to requirement of regulation and meets the need of keeping it confidential?
So if the data is encrypted in a TDE, transparent data encryption way, then it doesn't matter because we're working with the live data. If the data is encrypted at the column level, then unless we have the decryption keys, our application cannot discover it. If the data is encrypted using context-preserving encryption like Mentis does, meaning if you encrypt a credit card number, encrypt it with another credit card number, then our discovery will find it anyway. So multiple ways of answering that question. The more we know about what specifically your situation is, we can tailor our answer to meet that particular requirement. Hope that answered your question. So on how does your data discovery work on zipped or compressed files? So our application first unzips the file, does the discovery and zips it back. So then we'll need a little bit more space on those servers when you're doing that, but that would be the way we do it. We can also change the encoding. We can do all of that stuff. That's all part of our application. We've got a minute left. So any questions? Of course, we are all here. You can reach Sunil or me on LinkedIn. You know, both of us are quite active. We'd love to hear your questions. We'd like to answer them. And then we'll also be setting up some newer sessions. So if you have ideas on what you want us to discuss next, we'll be glad to do it.
Another thing that I want to share with everyone here is we are also contemplating doing some workshops around data privacy, starting from very basics. Why, there's a big noise about data privacy, and with that, there's a big confusion as well. So we are planning to, in association with some of the independent industry experts, we're planning to do some workshops as well, which we will come back to you as and when they are finalized. And obviously, we all are available, and over LinkedIn, over emails, phones. Reach out to us for any questions. We would love to answer them. We would love to work with you on your or your customers' data privacy requirements. If there are no other questions, I would love to now wind up the session. And thank you so much for joining us today. Stay safe, stay masked. Don't let the guard down, whether it's the real life situation of the data. That's all I can say. Thank you very much from all of us for joining us on this session. Thank you very much, Rajesh, for sharing your career story, your journey of Mentis, and also some very interesting points. Everybody learned, and I also learned. Although you and I have been talking very often, but I learned a lot of interesting things today. Thank you very much. You all have a good day.
Thank you. Stay safe. See you soon.